Good morning, and welcome to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover each and every week what drives today's leaders. On today's show, my co-host will be Kelly De La Torre, and we'll be doing a fantastic show on our Energy 101 segment. Happy New Year, Kelly.
Happy New Year to you too, Jan.
You know, as always, we talk about so many interesting things during Energy 101, and today we are talking about, again, energy security, but from a very different perspective today.
That is what I love about this show, is that we approach this same question about energy security and domestic energy supply from so many different angles, and we get to highlight these emerging technologies that are really making a difference.
Yep, and our guest today is the president and CEO of Independent Energy Partners, and this is really an interesting business with interesting technologies, Kelly.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to Al about, they've developed a new way to further extract not only our domestic oil reserves, but it has many, many, many other applications that I'll let Al talk about since he's more versed.
Absolutely. As Kelly said, our guest is Alan Forbes, the president and CEO of Independent Energy Partners. He's launched and grown more than a dozen energy-related ventures during his 25-year tenure in the energy industry. And he really has, his expertise spans so many different areas, including advanced power generation systems, internet security technologies, energy industry portals, and monitoring and control systems. Welcome to the show, Al.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Al, we were talking before the show, and I was focused on our domestic oil reserves, but you pointed out that these have so many more applications. Could you sort of talk about the framework for this technology and where it applies?
Sure. The geothermic fuel cell, which is the technology that we've patented and are developing, is primarily targeted at unconventional hydrocarbons. And that category includes things like oil shale, tar sands, several other categories of heavier oils, such as the type they produce in South America. And also, in addition to unconventional hydrocarbons, it's also applicable to unconventional oil production, which includes things like recovering stranded oil from these abandoned oil fields, where much of the oil that was originally discovered is left in place. So we have unconventional hydrocarbons on the one hand and unconventional hydrocarbon production on the other. And this geothermic fuel cell has applications across that whole range.
Al, based on something you just said, you have these abandoned oil fields. Why is so much oil left behind in this traditional extraction process that we know goes on?
Actually, there's a couple of reasons. The biggest being that the pressures that existed in the oil reservoirs when they were originally discovered and put into production has subsided over time, and the decreased pressure in the formation has forced the barrels per day in these wells to drop below a quantity that's economically feasible. The other aspect of it is a little bit combined with the pressure point. A lot of oil in traditional wells is thicker. It's the pressure required to move that heavier, thicker oil to production wells is another factor. So you wind up with secondary oil recovery in these abandoned wells involving techniques like steam injection, very prominent in California, for example, down in the Kern County area, where they burn natural gas, produce steam, inject the steam down into those old formations. The heat improves the viscosity, and the pressure that the steam is under as it's pushed into the ground repressurizes the formation, so then you start reproducing these old wells that have been shut in. So that's just one aspect of secondary oil recovery.
So, so is that how the idea for use of these geothermic fuel cells came about? Is that it's the same?
No, actually, it's a related application. The interesting point that'll be clear in just a moment when I talk about the geothermic fuel cell is that the strength of economics associated with unconventional oil recovery or unconventional hydrocarbon production really lies in a key economic consideration, and that is the cost of energy to heat the ground. And there is kind of the beginning of the story for the geothermic fuel cell. And it occurs really with an interest in oil shale, of which here in this Colorado and immediately surrounding area, we've got a couple of trillion barrels of known resource. And more specifically, work that Shell Oil Company was doing on the western slope, where they had taken an old technology that was developed back in the 40s, refined it based on material sciences and some technology advances, but it basically involved utilizing electrical resistance heaters that were basically cables that were dropped down into boreholes in oil shale formations, pushed electricity into those cables. It's kind of like the heater element inside a toaster, where the filaments turn red hot.
Sure.
Similar aspect happens with this shell process. The technical term is in situ conversion process. That's what they've patented. In our case, it's geothermic fuel cell. So here's basically how the GFC distinguishes itself in that cost of energy to heat the ground, and looking at that application that Shell's been, I would say over the last 10, 15 years, they've probably spent a couple $100 million trying to refine this in situ conversion process specific to oil shale production. In our case, one of the other principals in my company, Marshall Savage, who's credited as the inventor, pretty technically astute guy, had some unique insight into what Shell was doing, and also some interest in fuel cell technology, and realized or recognized that one particular type of fuel cell technology, solid oxide fuel cell in particular, operated at a very high temperature, almost the exact temperature Shell was trying to achieve with these resistance heaters, and uniquely among the categories of fuel cells, operates on multiple fuels. So a fuel cell is like a battery. As long as you continue putting fuel into it, it produces electricity. And in the case of solid oxide fuel cells, it produces not only electricity, but a very high temperature waste heat.
Wow.
And so the concept that was patented, and it's what we've developed, involves packaging solid oxide fuel cell technology as a downhole heater. And after a very brief startup period, and in particular oil shale, which is a very gassy process, a portion of the gases that are produced along with the oil are fed back into the fuel cell system to keep them running.
Okay.
The high operating temperature is the thermal input that actually recovers the oil. And since we're using fuel cells kind of in the opposite of what most people think, I always make it a point to comment that as a byproduct, we produce large amounts of baseload green electrical energy. So unlike Shell, that either has to purchase or produce this 7x24 electrical input to make these cables red hot, in our case, we use the waste heat from this fuel cell process as the thermal input, and we produce electricity as a byproduct. So the economics are, as a result, very strong.
Sure.
It's an electrochemical process. There's no combustion, so there's very little environmental impact in terms of emissions. It's in situ, so there's no mining and all of that tailing and things that people associate with resource production of this type. And as I said, as a byproduct, fuel cell electrical output qualifies as green energy like solar and wind. But unlike the intermittent nature of those two resources, when we go online and stay online, 7x24, we're producing energy just like you would get from Excel,
Sure.
From a coal-fired power plant.
So Al, talk about that a little bit, about the emissions. You mentioned it a minute ago. What kind of emissions are there when you're doing this kind of work, and especially as it compares to primary extraction methods?
Well, one of the unique things about fuel cell technology, it's talked about in the media regularly, is part of the future hydrogen economy. In the case of fuel cells, as you input fuel, and in our case it'll be natural gas, you produce electricity, and there's an exhaust stream that is mostly water vapor and a small component of carbon dioxide, which is easily separated and can be used for a variety of applications, such as enhanced oil recovery or some of the commercial markets that utilize CO2. So from an emission standpoint, and the term that is used routinely in the business, carbon footprint, we have a very, very small carbon footprint, just minimal.
So can you sort of frame up for the listener what it looks like when you go out to a well site? So how are these abandoned well sites, and then what's your approach with these fuel cells? How would that look?
Well, the actual hardware involves a circular tube. Inside there are packaged applications of this solid oxide fuel cell technology. We are actually excited that have recently entered into agreement with Delphi Corporation, who are producing prototypes and testing them as we speak. Those will be shipped here into Colorado this month, and we've engaged Colorado School of Mines, who will actually be locally doing the final prototype pre-field testing, and then actually we'll be in the field in 2014 and actually making oil in a field demonstration project in 2015, just to give you an idea of the timeline.
Yeah.
But in terms of what you see, these tubular configurations, they will be produced in either 15 or 30 foot lengths. They will be coupled up just as you would see oil field piping, dropped into a drill hole, the upper portion of which will be cased just as you would see a typical traditional oil well, so there are no groundwater issues. You would see a wellhead, and the matrix of these heater wells would have at specific spacing collection wells or production wells. So what happens is, in oil shale in particular, and it's not dissimilar in conventional fields with stranded oil, is that the hydrocarbon in oil shales referred to as kerogen, which is basically an immature oil, another 50 million years, and it would be liquid, like they're producing up in Bakken, in the Dakotas, and the Marcellus formations. So with the application of heat, specifically around 350 degrees centigrade, kerogen starts breaking down, and the oil, the energy component, actually pyrolyzes and becomes a vapor. And that vapor actually is what moves to these production wells, comes up the pipe, a portion of it, all of the oil component condenses out. About 2/3 of the energy is recovered in a very high quality oil, and about 1/3 is non-condensable gas, very similar to natural gas. That's what's recycled back into the fuel cell system to keep it running.
Keep it going.
Yeah.
If you could recover the unrecovered oil left in place, what do you anticipate the impact to the U.S. would be?
Well, the most significant part of answering that question in my mind is not so much becoming totally energy independent, because I think there's some geopolitical business issues and politics involved there, but the idea is to improve the energy security and the economic security as well of the United States by being able to produce its indigenous resources, domestic resources, with the end result being reducing its reliance on imported oils. And so the impact is several-fold. One, by being able to produce unconventional hydrocarbons of the quantities that we have here in this country, the immediate benefits become, of course, jobs, all the oil field services, the manufacturing production, but ultimately a lower price at the pump, lower energy costs. And then the bigger picture, macro kind of impact, is that it improves the overall energy security, and by, at the same point, the economic security for the United States. So,
right, and it also allows us to sort of, it seems like it would allow us to sort of pick and choose what countries we want to deal with in our oil consumption, because if there is a particularly volatile country, at least we'll have the leeway of saying, you know what, we're going to further extract our domestic reserves instead of deal with, say, Venezuela.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I think the points I always enjoy talking about with the geothermic fuel cell is that it actually addresses the couple of key technical and economic considerations that have kept a lot of our domestic resources being produced, and sort of by de facto all of the renewable energy stuff that gets talked about day in and day out, wind, solar, bio and diesel fuels. By being able to produce these oil shale oils, heavy oils like tar sands, in an environmentally sensitive way, and at low cost, really is pretty much a game changer.
It is. It is, and that's what I wanted to ask you about is talk about some of those game-changing things that could happen with this, because it seems like this is sort of a completely different way of handling this, but it's going to require some infrastructure investment, it sounds like, to be able to really get it to where it's a usable, functional technology. Can you address that to a certain extent?
I can. The infrastructure aspect of being able to deploy this geothermic fuel cell is not dissimilar to any other oil or gas production requirement. I mean, there's pipelines, pumping stations, what's referred to in the business as balance of plant, where oil, water, gases are separated before they enter the pipelines. I think the challenge, the kind of the age-old "what keeps me awake at night" kind of question that I had a concern with really had to do with the strong demand that we're seeing, interests around the world, China, Canada, South America,
sure.
Europe, Africa, and our investors have asked, with all of this interest, when you guys go commercial, how in the world are you going to ramp up to be able to manufacture these geothermic fuel cell components? And so I mentioned earlier Delphi Corporation. We had some work done by the Department of Energy to redesign the original work that was done by Pacific Northwest National Labs to design a prototype around our patents. We had that modified early last year that allowed us to interview and potentially work with existing industry that had already commercialized solid oxide fuel cell technology, and it would accelerate our time to the field by working with an industry partner rather than continuing to work with the Department of Energy and
sure.
Pacific Northwest National Labs specifically in sort of a greenfield grassroots approach. At the end of that redesign effort earlier last year, and the opportunity to interview a number of interested companies that were looking for a big market for their fuel cells, Delphi prevailed. And Delphi is a international company.
Yeah, massive.
Has a long history in ceramics, has developed a solid oxide fuel cell division, and bunch of great guys, huge ramp-up capability, and beyond their 30 or 40 major manufacturing facilities that are located around the globe. Part of what we had them agree to, or part of the deal, is that they are just referred to as our strategic global manufacturing partner. So in addition to their in-house capabilities, they're poised to engage with third-party contractors,
Sure.
big manufacturing concerns that would gear up and add to their capacity to meet a large demand.
That's great. That's great.
So, and then it seems like that could be a massive expansion. Do we, in your opinion, do we have the skilled workforce to do that? Delphi has the skilled workforce to do that, or is there some other areas that maybe we should look at as far as education?
I think in terms of actual commercialization and deployment of the geothermic fuel cell, I think from an education standpoint and existing workforce capability, we're in pretty good shape because it's a highly automated. It's one of the things Delphi brings is their their industrial, automotive, high-volume manufacturing capability. So I think the education process, in my view, really has more to do with opportunities like this, with folks like ICOSA, to raise our visibility and educate people, particularly the folks on the environmental side, who have kind of a standard position and pushback on emissions, water usage, just kind of the classic points that they stand on that we haven't purposely taken the opportunity to rebut or comment on up until recently.
Sure. So when you talk about that and you talk about some of that environmental pushback that I think every energy organization, even clean energy, faces, what are those barriers to development, both at the market level as well as the regulatory level for these cells?
I think with our initial development activities focused around this Rocky Mountain region, the Piceance Basin here in Colorado, the northeastern area of Utah, and southwestern Wyoming. I think that one of the regulatory issues that, again, I think is more of an education process, there's always a concern over water. And the traditional industry, earlier efforts in developing oil shale and some of the other mine-oriented resources used a lot of water. And western slope area, this is typically arid. So there's, I think, from a regulatory standpoint, there's going to be a close look at the impact of water utilized in our process. In our case, the bit of water that's required in the process, in the conditioning of fuel, is part of getting it ready to send back down as a fuel for the fuel cells. The bit of water required there is actually recovered from the exhaust stream from the fuel cell operation. So from a process standpoint, we're water neutral. So that's one of the things, from a regulatory standpoint, I know we're going to have to address that. The other, and it falls in the same category, is air emissions. People are going to say, what kind of air emissions are we talking about? And I think at the end of that discussion, we're going to be very favorably viewed, both from the water standpoint and the low carbon footprint with minimal emissions. But we're anticipating those things. I've built a lot of projects and gone through that whole permitting process, and I have a sense of the positions that people have, and it was some of the bigger reasons several years ago that got me excited about the geothermic fuel cell, because I realized that the variety of the various market forces that would eventually lead to a successful company included things like not just economics, but environmental sensitivities, water usage, air emissions, things like that.
How can listeners learn more about the organization? What's the website?
The website for the company is www.iepm.com.
That's www.iepm.com. Kelly, as always, this is a fascinating conversation. We have to run to break, but when we come back, we'll have more with Alan Forbes, the President and CEO of Independent Energy Partners, and we'll talk more about the work that they're doing with the new geothermic fuel cells. Kelly, I know you have a blog where people can learn a lot about the energy technologies we talk about here. Can you give listeners that information?
Yes, and I will post a summary of this conversation also on the Rocky Mountain Energy blog, which is rmenergyblog.blogspot.com.
Perfect. And if you want to learn more about any of the work that Kelly does, you can go there, or she is certainly one of our most prolific writers and bloggers here at the ICOSA organization. So you can go to theicosamagazine.com to learn more about so many of these fantastic energy things that we do. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.